Hello, the topic of this lecture will be challenges to utilitarianism. From here on in the course, we'll be taking a look at some very promising ethical theories and then taking a look at some challenges to those theories. And a lot of students sometimes get one of a couple of wrong ideas from this approach to studying various different theories in ethics. Uh, Partially, that's from the way we began. We started by examining several views, such as subjectivism, relativism, etc., and found that they had such bad problems even getting off the ground and trying to count as ethical views in the first place that we very quickly abandoned them. Well, utilitarian didn't have any of those kinds of problems. It does pretty clearly get off the ground. It's not clearly inconsistent with itself. It doesn't have a whole host of absurd consequences right off the bat. It's a really good theory. But a couple of things are also true. It's not the only good theory, and it's certainly not a perfect theory. And so one of the reasons that people come up with challenges to utilitarianism, certainly the ones that we've seen, is because utilitarianism is a good enough theory to actually warrant some time and effort thinking about it. It's good enough to generate really serious objections. But of course, all of these objections are also the kinds of things that utilitarians themselves have at least some reasonable responses to, even though they are, in fact, challenges to the theory of utilitarianism as a really, maybe as perhaps the best ethical theory, right? There may be reasons to think that it may not be, even though it's very good. Without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the uh, the first of those I'm going to take a look at isn't really contained in the reading, but well, not in the readings of this unit. If you read one of the optional readings from the last unit, that is Mill's utilitarianism, especially in chapter 2, he will have mentioned it there. But I'll talk about it here, because it's a prominent objection to utilitarianism. And it's what's called the philosophy of swine objection. Swine, of course, are pigs. Okay, and the way it goes is this: it's a very simple objection. It says, if what we're supposed to be doing here is totaling up all the pleasures or pains that result from our actions, then picking the one that results in the greatest pleasure, then what we're doing is we're valuing pleasure over everything else. And the objection goes this way: that if all we're concerned about is pleasure, then really we're valuing the life of a pig in slop and not really a life that's fit for human. In short, there seems to be the objection is that there's more to life than just pleasure. And so in focusing and maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain, it seems like we're missing some great large part of the point of good human existence and all that. Right. Well, that's the objection. The most notable responder to this particular objection, as I mentioned a minute ago, is John Stuart Mill. Here's a photograph of him. He's interesting story about John Stuart Mill. He's the son of author James Mill, who was a very, very close friend of Jeremy Bentham. In fact, one of the things that Bentham really lamented is that when he met resistance in describing his idea of utilitarianism, which we saw in the last unit, he ran up against some people who objected to it, and he thought if people were raised as utilitarians, some of these objections wouldn't even occur to them, right? If they were, taught from an early age to think like utilitarians, it would not seem strange at all. Some of the things about utilitarianism that do occasionally seem strange to people. And he had a reasonable point there. And it turns out that his good friend James Mill had a young son, John Stuart. Now, this is something that many intellectual parents do: is they experiment on their children, and that's true then as it's true now. Uh, and Mill was raised explicitly. He was sort of their experiment. He was encouraged, sort of not really to have much contact with other children because they, have a corrupting influence, of course. And he was raised explicitly to be a sort of genius defender of utilitarianism who would take over after Bentham was dead. Um, and here's the funny part of this. This is the part where you expect to say, and everything went off the rails, and he was put under so much pressure that he cracked mentally and all that. And then he rebelled against everything, right? Well, not so much actually. As it turns out, he wrote one of the very most important books about utilitarianism. It's a book called Utilitarianism, and he became one of the greater defenders of the theory, even though there was some episodes in his youth that I don't know. I think, and this is me not as a real historian, but just a suspicion. The kinds of stories you hear are that when Mill was in, was about 19 or so, he had something as like a nervous breakdown and swore off utilitarianism and rebelled against everything. And everyone says that, yeah, see, that's what happens when you push a kid too hard. I just think that's what happens when somebody's 19. So I don't know, but in any case, he did eventually come around, and he was an extremely bright child, had the best of educations, and was certainly one of the best writers and thinkers of the entire 19th century, and made contributions to more than just utilitarianism in philosophy. So in any case, Mill takes on the philosophy of swine objection and takes it on in this way. He begins his reply with something of a fork. He says, look, one of two things has to be true here. Either it's true that the pleasures that satisfy a pig are the same ones that satisfy a human. Okay? And if it is true, well, then we're just being arrogant and being offended by that, right? If it really is true that pleasure is just the best thing, then the best life for us and the best life for a pig really are the same thing, and we need to get over ourselves. Okay, um, and so that's one half of the fork. But of course, most people say, well, look, I really just don't think it's true that 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 the life of a pig is the best life also for a human, or that the pleasures that satisfy a pig are good enough for a human. And that's where he intends you to go with this other end of the fork. So if the pleasures that do satisfy a pig are the very same as the ones that satisfy a human, right? Um, well, then if that's not true anyway, that stops being an objection to utilitarianism. Okay, as long as some utilitarian can account for the difference and can say, well, here's the kinds of things, here's the kinds of pleasures we want to try and maximize for humans, right? That we don't really have to worry about for pigs. Okay, and that's what Mill basically does. He introduces this idea of a distinction between higher quality pleasures, that is more refined and fit for human well-being, and these lower quality pleasures that are sort of more basic and animal. And he says things like the following. If you had read chapter 2 of Utilitarianism, you would have seen some of this. That first of all, nobody would consent to become an animal, okay, even if they were to get the full quantity of animal pleasures. Okay, I mean, I'll have to be honest with you. My dog and my cat have pretty easy lives, but I wouldn't really swap places with them, even if I were convinced that I'd be very satisfied. In fact, I am convinced I'd be very satisfied with my life were I my dog or my cat, but I wouldn't do it anyway. Okay, and he likewise says no intelligent person would consent to become a fool, even if they could be assured that fools have more fun. No educated person would give up their learning, even if they were sure that ignoramuses were more satisfied with their lives. And the way he puts it this way, better Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. So he thinks that there are different qualities of pleasure. There are certain kinds of pleasure that pigs are simply not capable of, but that human beings are, and that has to be taken into account. Notice this is actually a pretty big departure from the way that Bentham thought about pleasures. Bentham thought about pleasures strictly in terms of their quantity. And in fact, he would have very much disagreed with this idea of qualities of pleasure. But Mill thinks that's the most natural way to respond to the philosophy of swine objection. All right, so a second argument, a second objection we can take a look at to utilitarianism is in the Schäfer-Landau reading. We can call it the measurement argument, and it goes like this. It says, premise one, utilitarianism is only true if there is a precise unit of measurement that can determine the value of an action's results. Premise two, there is no such unit of measurement, therefore utilitarianism is false. It's plain old, plain old modus ponens. Um, there you go. So would be really modus tollens now that I'm looking at it, but it's valid as written. I mean, you can sort of review the definition of validity if you don't quite see why, but it's very clear that if those premises were true, the conclusion couldn't fail to be false. Okay, so the argument is at least valid. Well, okay, now, so if the conclusion is untrue, then it must be that one of the two premises is false. So let's examine each of those premises in turn to see if how plausible they are on their own. So let's start with the second premise, that there is no such unit of measurement. There is no unit of measurement of pleasure. Okay. Well, yeah, that's true. We don't have one of those. We do not have a standard unit for pleasure. We don't have a metric unit for pleasure. We should perhaps call them hedons if we did. Okay, that would be a great name for them. but certainly that's not the case. Now, Bentham, I think, had in mind something like this. I think he wanted there to be sort of, hedons of pleasure. And I don't think he ever thought that, someone would ever come up with a gadget. You could sort of point at somebody and like scan for hedons or something like that. And, how many hedons of pleasure are they experiencing per se? I don't know. I don't think he had that in mind, but I think he did have a very quantifiable notion of pleasures in mind. Certainly, if we go Mill's route and start talking about qualities of pleasure in addition to quantity, and sort of over and above quantity, then certainly we can't do that anymore. And so, yes, we don't have a standard unit of measurement of pleasure, and we don't have any way of measuring it, even if we did have such a unit. And so let's look instead at premise one. Utilitarianism is only true if there is a precise unit of measurement that can determine the value of an action's results. Let's take a look at that. And that looks tempting, okay? But it falsely assumes that quantification or comparison requires numerical measurement. It certainly doesn't, right? Some situations produce more happiness than others, even if we do not or cannot quantify that happiness. If you think of a lot of things, right? So it can be tempting to try and reduce lots of different things to, sort of to that which is quantifiable. And I think that's a good temptation to have. It helps people be more precise if they try and do that. But not everything, there's an awful lot of qualitative judgment that we engage in as human beings. And that's just part of life, right? And we don't have to quantify anything for there to be a real difference between two things. So in this case, we don't have to be able to quantify pleasures for there to be a real difference between pleasures of one thing and pleasures of another, or the amounts of pleasure, or the qualities of pleasure, etc. All right, a third objection, and this is where we start to get into the ironic bit of this. Okay, if you'll recall, in the previous unit, we talked about there being three things that people really liked about, there's several things actually that people liked about utilitarianism, and one of those things is that it's very demanding, right? It's one of these moral theories that has something to say about literally everything because everything has consequences. And if we want a moral theory, we want it to be thorough. We want it to actually be able to give us a verdict, etc. And utilitarianism certainly does that. It absolutely is a demanding moral theory. The objection starts off by asking, well, is it too demanding, right? So this thing that lots of people like about utilitarianism is also one of the things that lots of people don't like about utilitarianism. And the objection goes this way. Utilitarianism, you might say, is motivationally too demanding, okay? Because it would have us think about nothing but the greatest good all the time, okay? I mean, think about what that would be like. Imagine, like, for example, if you had breakfast this morning, right? Say, yeah, I put a Pop-Tart in the toaster, because if you're eating a Pop-Tart without a toaster, you're some cave person or something. And so yeah, you put a Pop-Tart in the toaster. Well, I mean, instead of doing that, could you have woken up 15 minutes earlier and made up a few eggs, okay, or done something a little fancier, or even made Pop-Tarts for several other people that you might happen to live with? It seems like you could have at least done something that other people would have enjoyed, that would have brought more pleasure into the world than just eating a Pop-Tart, okay? And so it seems like if utilitarianism is to be taken seriously, then you acted immorally just making breakfast for yourself when you could have done something that yielded much more pleasure instead. So it seems like we're faced all the time with these kinds of options where we could do something other than what we in fact did that would have resulted in somewhat more pleasure or even a lot more pleasure. And so it seems like maybe that would get a little carried away. Okay? And so again, this is a real challenge. This is a problem for utilitarianism. It perhaps is too demanding motivationally. But they do have, utilitarians I mean, have a reasonable reply. Okay, and the reply goes something like this: that utilitarianism is best considered as a standard of rightness and not necessarily as a decision procedure. That is, it produces the best overall consequences, not to think about just the consequences all the time, than it does to go overboard anticipating unknown consequences. Okay, and this is very interesting. I sort of have to highlight this. This is a very interesting move that utilitarians make, that certainly modern utilitarians make this move all the time. And so a lot of the objections to utilitarianism concern how to practically put it into operation in your daily life. And I think a lot of modern utilitarians have said, well, look, What we're really interested in is utilitarianism as a standard of rightness and wrongness, right? So the idea is that utilitarianism tells us very, very clearly what makes something right or what makes it wrong. It's right if it gives you the best overall consequences of any option available to you, and it's wrong if it doesn't, right? And that seems very, very clear. But it's a little bit like something like a follow through in a golf swing or something, right? I mean, really, whatever happens after the club face contacts the ball is entirely relevant to the flight of the ball. It really is. But the idea is that aiming for the right follow through can actually maybe make that contact somehow better. The idea is that there might be other decision procedures, right? You might, in fact, generate the best overall consequences by not thinking all the time about the consequences, right? If there's some other decision procedure you can use, then that's what utilitarianism would demand that you do, because that in fact has the better overall consequences. It's a very subtle response. It can get very confusing, and I recommend that you sort of pause this and think about it if you're not quite sure, and maybe go back and look over this another couple of times, or even ask a question if you're not quite clear how this works, because it's a reply that we'll see and be able to use in a number of other places. The utilitarians are more concerned with their theory being a standard of rightness and wrongness than an action guiding principle. And so for this, you can see the Bernard Williams reading for some cases that seem to indicate some other sort of motivational shallowness for utilitarianism, or some idea that perhaps it's too motivationally demanding on us. So another way of taking a look at the demandingness of utilitarianism is to ask whether utilitarianism is too demanding on our actions, okay? Because it would require us to always do that which had the best consequence, right? Now notice this is a pretty high bar. Okay, this isn't just how many consequences do we have to think about all the time, and how do we have to be motivated. This is a question of really actually getting it right all the time. Okay, if this is what the theory demands of us, maybe it demands too much, because of course we know that this is a moral theory that will fall well short of achieving. And again, the utilitarian has a very sensible reply here. They say, well, yes, that's true. It would. It would absolutely demand that you achieve the best overall consequences every time you act, because what would be best? You can't change what morality requires of you because you think it's too much. Okay. The idea is that it's certainly practically non-feasible for us to get the best consequences literally all the time. But the thing is, don't we want a moral ideal, even if that ideal is practically out of reach, right? After all, we do still bother having laws, even though we know there will always be law breakers, right? So the point of having a moral theory is to give us something to aim at, right? Not necessarily something that we have to be able to perfectly achieve. Right? The fact that we can't perfectly achieve it doesn't necessarily mean it's not a good idea. And so this is where I want to point you to the reading from Peter Singer. Peter Singer is a utilitarian, and he will give, once you're sort of keyed in to look for it, an exceptionally standard utilitarian argument for what to do about world poverty. And I hope after you finish that reading, you see just how much utilitarianism really does ask of us. And that's where you get this objection that people sometimes make, that it is too demanding on our actions. And okay, yet another way for utilitarianism to perhaps be too demanding is in this notion of there being no supererogatory acts. Right. This also ties in very strongly with the Peter Singer reading. So utilitarianism makes the optimific action, that is the best overall action, the only morally acceptable action all the time. And so there would be no supererogatory actions. So this is a nice word you can pull out and use to impress your friends later. Supererogatory means actions that are good, but that go beyond what is morally required. These are sort of above and beyond the call of duty, as it were. So for example, say that some person I knew was very ill and needed a kidney, okay? It would perhaps be very kind of me, very, very nice of me, exemplary and praiseworthy for me to give them my kidney. But I don't know that it would be morally required of me to give my kidney to somebody in need, while I was still alive, and certainly everything like that. And so that's the kind of thing that we think. We often think of various kinds of charity as supererogatory. It's very nice of you to give to those in need, but not necessarily required. Again, circumstance can play a role in that, but there's lots of things that we think are supererogatory, the things that are genuinely good, but that are not necessarily morally required of you. And again, the utilitarianism has a reply. They say, yes, it's true that there would be no supererogatory acts. Okay, but again, don't we want a moral ideal, even if that ideal is practically out of reach? Um, and again, we've got the same example here. We do still bother with laws, even though we know there will always be lawbreakers. Again, the point is that if you want a moral theory, don't you want a moral theory that really does always tell you what to do and that really does actually expect the best of you? Uh, After all, do we want, instead of utilitarianism, some moral theory to tell us, well, there's good enough, right? All you have to be is good enough. I mean, and then we have another one that says, no, 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 you have to be as good as you can if you really want to be as good as you can. So it seems like the second of those is the more desirable moral theory, and certainly utilitarianism does fill that role. But again, it's weird that it would have no supererogatory actions, and it's a thing. It's a problem for utilitarianism. Is that that's the thing we normally think there is. Utilitarianism would say there isn't any of that. All right, continuing on, one of the other things that people really liked about utilitarianism is that it's a highly impartial moral theory. The question might be, is it too impartial? And here's what you might mean by that. This objection comes from a writing by Bernard Williams, not the one that's linked in the reading section, but it does come from him. Just imagine it this way. So here's a thought experiment. So imagine that there are two people drowning at sea, and your boat can only get to one of them before they drown. Okay, certainly you have to go to one of them first. Okay, you're equally close to both of them. One of those people, so this is, it's a hard decision up until now for most folks. One of those people is your spouse, and the other is a stranger. And again, most people find this to be a very, very easy decision. Okay, but in Bernard Williams's words, the utilitarian here has sort of one thought too many. So if you think about it from the utilitarian perspective, what is important, right? How are you supposed to, sort of make your decision? What are you supposed to do? Well, again, remember the utilitarian demands that you take all of the the actions that are available to you. I guess one action available to you is that you go after neither one of them. You let them both drown. Obviously, probably not the best consequences. Probably much better to save one of them than to let both drown, almost certainly. So you're gonna have to save at least one of them, okay? And so now the question is which one? You might say, "Oh, look, you'd miss your spouse if you let them die. That'd be terrible." But of course, you don't really know anything about this other person. Perhaps they're married to more than one person, and whether that's legal or not. Maybe they've maybe you say, oh well, my family will certainly miss my spouse. Like, well, what if the other one has a bigger family, right? I mean, it's or has a family who would miss them more or less. You just don't know, and so you start going through all these possible avenues, trying to anticipate these consequences, and eventually, as like maybe the last tiebreaker, you're like, okay, this person's my spouse and the other person isn't. I have no sort of special loyalty to them or something like that. I don't know, but basically, it's the very last tiebreaker. And so, can you imagine, like, going and saving your spouse, pulling them out of water, and saying, they say, "Oh, thank you for saving me from drowning." You say, "Well, it was the very last tiebreaker that you were my spouse, and so I'm here as opposed to over there." It was a very near thing. Um, I don't know how far that's going to get you in life, and so Williams very often thinks that the kinds of motivations that you might be expected to have as a utilitarian are just alien to sort of ordinary human psychology. Um, he makes a use of a lot of things like that. In the reading that is linked from Williams, it's something of the reverse case. Here we have a case that's really really hard for the utilitarian, but for most people it's a very easy choice. In Williams's writing, he gives you a couple of cases that I think are really hard choices for most people, but for the utilitarian they're very very easy. And he thinks there's something fishy about utilitarianism and its relation to moral motivation. Um, and so the utilitarians have a number of replies here. One reasonable reply is this, that despite its strangeness in some cases, everybody who really thought like a utilitarian wouldn't actually find anything strange about this, right? I mean, if you really are committed to the idea that the best overall consequences are what you ought to be trying to get, well, then here it is. There's the best overall consequences. That's what you should be trying to do. And it doesn't seem weird that you should be trying to do that. despite the fact that it may not be the sort of thing that we're sort of brought up believing you ought to do. So that's one reply. And of course, again, we can circle back to one of the earlier replies made, that the utilitarians perhaps more concerned with utilitarianism as a standard of rightness and wrongness, right, than as a than as an action guiding principle. And so here they say, well, look, maybe you're not supposed to think like a utilitarian, so long as however you are thinking ends up generating the best overall consequences as often as you can. So that's another reasonable response a utilitarian might make. So moving on, one of the other things that lots of people like about utilitarianism is that it's very flexible, right? That it doesn't always say that the same, some particular kind of thing, say like lying or whatever, is always morally wrong or always morally right. So people like the flexibility of utilitarianism, but of course you might object that it's too flexible. So the objection goes like this. If some exotic situation arose in which killing somebody led to the best overall consequences of any available action, then not only would it be the right thing to do, it would actually be the obligatory thing to do. You would be morally required to kill somebody, perhaps even an innocent person. Okay, and that really sounds absurd. That's a big sticking point for a lot of folks. Um, and again, the utilitarians might have a couple of replies here. They say, number one, it really only sounds absurd if you think that there's something more to morality than consequences. And so, of course, if you already think that utilitarianism is not the right moral theory, then this is going to be one more reason why you don't think utilitarianism is the right moral theory. But you don't want to just say that it's wrong because it's wrong, right? Or you don't want to assume it's wrong because you assume it's wrong. Um, and I think the utilitarian is a reasonable reply here. If the consequences really are all that matters, and the utilitarian has the right read on what kinds of consequences are morally relevant, then yeah, sometimes in some exotic circumstances it might require things that in normal circumstances would never generate good consequences. And we should just hope that those situations are very exotic indeed, that they just don't occur very often, if ever. And so again, for a much more thorough and thought-provoking analysis of just this exact objection, you should see J.J.C. Smart's work on the problem that utilitarianism has with justice. He brings up a very a powerful thought experiment about the sheriff. So when you read that, pay special attention to the sheriff case and Smart's discussion of it. Smart himself is in fact a utilitarian, a very committed utilitarian, but is bringing up this challenge to utilitarianism because he thinks it's a worthy challenge, an important thing to think about. So to sum things up, the best features of utilitarianism, that is the things people really like about utilitarianism, its demandingness, its impartiality, its flexibility, are also some sources of some very reasonable objections to utilitarianism, things that people very reasonably might not like about the moral theory, some things that might really be wrong with it. And so for the purposes of this unit, it's really important to keep track of some things, right? It's not enough just to have sort of a vague idea of, oh yeah, some people don't like utilitarianism and other people do, because that's more than that's there's a lot more than that going on here. What you'll want to keep track of for the purposes of papers, exams, those sorts of things, you want to keep track of what these objections really are, right? What specific things do people say is wrong with utilitarianism? You want to keep track of where they're from, right? Who generates these kinds of objections. It makes it easier to keep track of them that way. And how they're presented, right? How you explain, well, here's all the relevant parts. And that includes sometimes relevant thought experiments. For example, like the thought experiment with J.J.C. Smart's sheriff is one in particular, but you'll see a bunch of them in Schaefer-Landau and other parts of the reading as well. Um, and you should also keep track of what kinds of replies that the utilitarian might reasonably make, because these aren't the kinds of challenges that sort of prevent utilitarianism from ever getting off the ground. Uh, some people find some of these objections to be fairly decisive in saying that utilitarianism maybe is not the best moral theory, but it's not the sort of thing where any of these objections make utilitarianism entirely untenable or unreasonable. There are some things that the utilitarian can reasonably say to defend their moral theory. Even if not everybody finds those things persuasive, they are still basically reasonable, and so you should keep track of all of those things. And so, having kept track of all those things, I would recommend maybe keeping something like a table in your notes where you can sort of put headings on each of those things to keep track of one thing or other, because there is a lot, and there's a lot of detail, and as always, the detail matters.